Back to Good Morning Tobago on Tobago Updates. Well, viewers, the political scene is very, very hot in Tobago, as you guys have been observing over the past week or so. I mean, it's quite a lot of buzz, so much buzz that we had the Prime Minister here at a political meeting in Calder Hall yesterday evening. And now to discuss some of the things that was said on the platform, yes, last night, as a matter of fact, we have Senator Lawrence Hislop on set with us. Good morning and welcome to you, sir. How are you doing?
Morning, Kandace. Thank you for having me. I'm doing fine. I'm doing great this morning.
Great. So let's get into that meeting last night. First of all, we had the Prime Minister here in Tobago at a time when local government election campaigning is heating up in Trinidad. Yeah. Just tell me about him being here.
Well, remember the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. And even if local government elections are heating up in Trinidad, there was something critical that he needed to come to address. Because it is critical for us in our governance, and that is the chief administrator. And that was the main reason why he decided to have a conversation with us, with Tobagonians, about what transpired and what is transpiring with the whole chief administrator issue. So that is why he chose to come to speak to us directly and not. I know some people would always have an issue with him speaking from Trinidad. So he decided to come to Tobago to speak to us, to educate us, to bring us up to speed on the process, and as the reason why at this time we are without a chief administrator.
Now, hearing that explanation, actually, before you hear that explanation, I want you to go through some of the things that the Prime Minister explained about why we are in a position without a chief administrator right now.
Well, as he laid out the timelines as to when the conversation actually started and why we are in now. The dates are a lot of dates in terms of the letters being
starting as far back as November 22.
As far back as November. And one of the things that he highlighted was the fact that this would not have been an issue had the conversation come up that the person who was in line, there were questions to be asked of this person. And so if the situation started since November with the initial letters between the then chief ad and the permanent secretary in the Prime Minister's office about this movement having to take place, if everything went as normal or as planned, then we would have had a chief ad. Because as he highlighted, one was to go off on retirement on the 17th, I think it was, and the other one, based on the letter, was to come in right after the day after. But because there was this whole issue that arose, that's why we ended up in the situation. And then to add to that, you had the situation with the deputy chairman of the Public Service Commission, that also his contract also ended, so that vacancy needed to be filled. Okay. So that is why we unfortunately, that's why we're in the situation that we're in.
Are you satisfied with the explanation provided by the Prime Minister?
Well, yes, because the explanation given by the Prime Minister was clearly laid out in the guidelines, the law, the steps that are to be followed in order for us to get to the point of a chief administrator. And the reality is the average citizen would not have known all of these intricate steps. Because on the 17th or on the 18th, we would have gotten up the next morning and we had a chief ad. But because things came in to interfere with those steps, so I'm satisfied, and I could speak for those who were at the meeting last night, and even those who may have been listening. If you listened objectively, I can't see why you couldn't understand what the Prime Minister was trying to explain, bar all the dates and the timelines that he was
What about
given.
In terms of the role of the Public Service Commission? Because key to all of this, the Public Service Commission is the link between, making sure that they formulate that person and forward it to the Prime Minister for approval, and then it comes back to them to enact it.
Right.
What about their role in all of this? What are your opinions and as to, what went wrong there as well?
No, I don't think anything went wrong from a Public Service Commission standpoint, because just as the Prime Minister, the Public Service Commission followed the guidelines that are laid out and based on the law. And so I don't think from a Public Service Commission standpoint there was an issue, right? Based on what was said last night and what has been in the space since then, we recognize that there was a there had to be an issue from a chief at Tobago House of Assembly situation where everything just didn't seem to coincide or gel cohesively enough for the process to be as smoothly as it normally is. Because this is something that has been done since we started to have administrators and chief administrators in the Tobago House of Assembly. And so obviously there was a breakdown based on the steps that were laid out last night by the Prime Minister. There was a breakdown when it comes to what the chief ad was supposed to do, what and I don't even want to bring the politicians into this, because what he clearly laid out last night were the steps that were to be taken by the public servants. Right? And those steps were not followed as they should have been from a THA standpoint. And because of that, we ended up in the situation that we.
Now, have you used your power as a senator to, sort of see what's going on and to see if there's a way that we could resolve this situation? Because unfortunately, until this situation is resolved, as former Chief Secretary Ho Choi Charles yesterday stated, it's a disastrous situation because the role of the chief administrator is so important and crucial to the business of the assembly.
Well, what I could tell you is that from my position, I have no power where that is concerned. The persons who are dealing with it, because as the Prime Minister said, hopefully by this week, all of that should be sorted out. Because the Public Service Commission now has a deputy chairman. Obviously, they would now forward who the person should be. That will come to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister will treat with it. He and the Chief Secretary will consult. So I don't think this week should pass without us having a chief ad. If it does, then early in the new week, I believe it should be sorted out. So those who have the power to deal with it are treating with it.
Now, there was quite a few other allegations or interesting things that came out from what the Prime Minister said. He accused this present administration of, playing the blame game.
Yeah.
In the same way that the opposition is in Trinidad. And I want to get your view on that.
Well, listen, Tobagonians, citizens can see for themselves that when this administration won the election, as the Prime Minister re-emphasized last night, he gave clear directives to his ministers. He took it upon himself to give all the necessary assistance that the Tobago House of Assembly required, because of the fact that it was a young administration with inexperienced persons. And even Mr. Ho Choi Charles spoke to that the entire Executive Council were practically inexperienced people. And so the Prime Minister went out of his way to assist the administration to make sure that everything runs. Because at the end of the day, what people need to understand is, being the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, you still have a responsibility for governance to be done seamlessly and smoothly, even in Tobago, even if you don't have direct responsibility. And so he instructed his cabinet ministers who have partner secretaries in Tobago, meet with them, treat with them, give them whatever assistance they require. And the admission by some of the senior people in the THA is that these meetings were very cordial. Right, were extremely cordial, and they were given the assistance that they needed. I don't understand where the fight, where the bacchanal started, why we now have a situation that everything that arises in Tobago that the administration is unable to manage, it is the central government's fault. It is the Prime Minister's fault. You have been elected by the people to govern, to manage Tobago, to manage a budget allocation that is sent to Tobago. If you are unable to do that, how is that the central government's fault? And now we have a situation where there's all this back and forth and all this argument about.
And the situation has accelerated so much that the Prime Minister last night said that he doesn't want to have a conversation anymore with the Chief Secretary unless there's a third person present.
No, for me, that hit me really hard last night. And this is not, and I'm not saying this from a party standpoint, I'm saying this from a Tobagonian standpoint. When our Prime Minister can say that he does not want to have a conversation with our Chief Secretary unless there is a third party, that does not augur well for our governance. When the two most senior politicians between Trinidad and Tobago can't have a conversation one-on-one because one is afraid that whatever is said in that conversation could be revealed.
Do you think it's justified?
Well, you have to ask the Prime Minister that. And based on what has transpired within the last couple of weeks with the Chief Administrator issue and then the issue of Friday's media briefing, where allegations were made. Now, the average person hearing that two senior government officials would have called and said, pay these monies to this contract. The average person automatically would think the two persons, and I thought it even before the Prime Minister said it last night, that the two senior people that the Chief Secretary could be alluding to is the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance. Mm-hmm. And when we have a situation like that, and the Prime Minister is now saying, I don't want to have no conversation with the Chief Secretary unless there is a third party, something is wrong with the governance in Tobago.
And it's interesting because that reaction seems to be so similar to what's going on with the opposition, the relationship with the opposition, which is so adversarial in Trinidad at this point in time.
Yeah, well, you see, I sit in a place where you see things firsthand. And what is significant is a level of, and hate is a strong word, but there's a level of despise that is you see coming from the opposition for sometimes no reason whatsoever, and you wonder why. Yeah, and so in Trinidad there is that dynamic and there's that understanding, and it has even gotten worse as we get closer to local government election, right? But it is sad that we have to come to a point, because even as adversarial as Mr. Charles was in his tenure as Chief Secretary, we never had a Prime Minister utter those words. And Mr. Charles has been able to straddle both entities in Trinidad. But you never had either of those Prime Ministers saying, I don't want to talk to Mr. Charles unless there's a third party.
All right, we're going to stick a pin there on this conversation, but we got to take a quick break. So viewers, please don't go anywhere, because we'll be back right after this.
The energy filled the sky. Hey. Tobago updates. Na, 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 na. Good morning, Tobago. Na, 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 na. Wake up with Kandace and...
Welcome back to Good Morning Tobago on Tobago Updates. And we're not just Tobago Updates, viewers. In case you haven't found out yet, or you've been living under a rock, we are Tobago Updates Television. And you can view us on channel 102 on Amplia for 24-hour programming. Yes, all it is Tobago is coming to you through your TV sets via the Amplia facilities. So get connected and see all the good stuff that we have to offer. All right, viewers, so we are continuing our conversation with Senator Lawrence Hislop as we discuss some of the things that came out of the PNM political meeting last night in Calder Hall. Now, before we went to the break, we were talking a little bit about some of the adversarial relationships that's developing between the central government and the THA. And we're seeing, we heard the accusations from the Prime Minister that it is mirroring that of the relationship between the opposition and the central government, which is also very adversarial. Now, I mean, some of the accusations that were made last night was that for the Chief Secretary, Fali Augustine, and his team are aligned to the UNC. Is there any evidence that you guys have that points to that?
But if you want to put it this way, the proof is in the eating. So there may not be cold hard evidence, but when you look at the behaviors are too similar. I'll give you one example. I sat on the research that created all of this hoopla, and one of my colleagues on the Joint Select Committee was there but didn't ask a single question. And to me that says a lot, because that particular colleague is one of the most vocal colleagues on the committee. And we had an opportunity to scrutinize the THA within a particular period. And I found it passing strange that my colleague would not even ask one question for that entire sitting. And even some of the actions of the administration seem to mirror what we experience or what is experienced in Trinidad. Because for me, what is the need to pick fights? Let's take, for example, the road down at Chauvin. What's the reason to pick a fight when the law clearly states until the law changes, you have to apply for a CEC? Why not apply for the CEC and get the road done?
Well, on the flip side, you can also ask, what's the reason for picking a fight about, some of the other road projects that were completed, for instance, the one to Dutch Fort?
No, but it's not about picking. That was not about picking a fight. That was highlighting that the cost and the way the contract was negotiated. There are questions to be answered. So that's not picking a fight. When the minority asks particular questions about why this road was done in the way it was done, why this contract within such a short period of time between what do you call it, the submission and then the award, why the haste, why the rush? Something seems fishy, and that's asking pertinent questions. But when you come to a situation where you have a planned project that has been on the books, you are now in office seeking to execute that project. What's the haste in trying to do the project without getting your necessary approvals? Knowing that if you don't get the necessary approvals, there is a possibility that you could be challenged by the authority or the agency that is responsible for that.
Now, I want to address the matter of that $100 million that was allocated in the mid-year budget review.
Yeah.
You kind of touched on it a little bit before, but I'm going to get now, because when we listened to the Minister of Finance, he did not even mention that in his initial statement in Parliament. And I might be wrong, but there was not much, or was there much said as to the explanation for what that money was intended?
And so we're speaking to the 100 million.
The 100 million that was allocated
outside of the mid-year review.
So so it was not a part of the mid-year.
No, that was you see, and that's the thing. That 100 million that the Prime Minister spoke to, that the Chief Secretary spoke to, was given outside of the mid-year review.
So separate and apart of the budget
that's
allocation.
Right, because as the Prime Minister explained last night, when the fortunes of the country started to turn around in terms of its revenue, each ministry was asked, or each ministry brought the debt that it incurred through COVID, brought that to the fore with the finance minister. And as he said, the THA was not left out. And so that 100 million was to assist the THA in clearing off some of the debt as well.
What do you know about the details of which debts it was supposed to be cleared by that money?
No, but you see, that's the thing about the THA. Once the government sends the money, once the central government forwards an allocation to the Tobago House of Assembly, the THA has within its power to move around the money, to put the money. So even if the monies were negotiated from central government to do a particular thing, once that comes to Tobago, the THA has the power to say, we are going to take this money and do X, Y, Z instead, accordingly, as the needs arise. And so it could have been negotiated for a particular thing, as with all the other ministries saying, we want this to do that. And it was the additional assistance to help clear debt. I don't know exactly what the debt was. But the fact of the matter is, the THA made a request, and the central government acceded to the request, and the 100 million was given.
Have you been speaking with any of the contractors that are owed money? And have you been making any petitions to the government, to the THA, etc., on their behalf to help them be able to get the money that's owed to them?
No, but you see, that's clearly the responsibility of the Tobago House of Assembly. You are there. You know the situation. You came into office saying that you will do things differently, and whatever the issue is, you are going to fix it. But we into a year and a half of an administration, and you have contractors literally crying out. For any project that starts in Tobago, you have contractors crying out for work. They want to get work. And you're telling me, and I go back to that Chauvin Road because it is a significant chunk of our development budget. Now you're telling me that 64, 65 million or how much is the value for the work there. You're telling me that you could not have found 3 Tobago contractors or even 2 who had the ability to do that work at Chauvin. Split it up into packages. Because as was said,
even though these people are already owed some money.
But that's the thing about even in Trinidad, there are contractors who are owed significant money. That's the government system, unfortunately.
And even in a situation where the arrangement was to do that bolt arrangement where you pay later.
But you see, we pretend as if that method is an old method. If it was not an old method, or if it was an old method, let me put it this way, we would not have had a debt. It is obviously that contractors in Tobago did the same thing for years. They used their own finances to do work and to be paid later by the Tobago House of Assembly. That's why we have a debt.
I also want to address the $300 million that was, $100 million in contracts that was allegedly awarded, prior to the elections. That this is the accusations that's coming from the chief secretary, right? These were awarded prior to the elections, and that's sort of setting up a situation where it might be difficult for the THA, based on their allocations from central government, to be able to pay all of those debts within, let's say, a year or 2 time.
But you see, all governments incur debt, and all new administrations incur debt from an old administration, because governance is a continuum. Governance is about the public servants working within a framework of policy created by a political party or a government. And so all governments incur debt. And I was fortunate to be part of a lecture done by a senior member of the IDB, and he said that this notion that we have that debt is bad for governments is a wrong notion. It's how you manage your debt. All governments incur debt because there are things that you have to do that you are unable to do with your revenue, but you have to provide a service to your population. And so when you talk about a $300 million debt that was incurred, that was work that was done to the benefit of Tobagonians.
But then how should the THA then deal with that, given the constraints of
an allocation?
Of an allocation that's actually even less than that debt that was incurred?
How did previous administrations do it? You have to negotiate with your contractors. You have to talk to your contractors.
But in a situation where you have one contractor demanding all the payments, no.
And that's what I'm saying. You have to talk to your contractors. You have to negotiate with your contractors. Because you look at, even in Trinidad, there are major contractors in Trinidad that are owed millions of dollars. But what happens? These same contractors continue to get work. Because this is what a contractor understands. If I continue to work in the environment, if I continue to do the work in the country, it means that I continue to get monies. So yeah, I worked with a particular contractor on the airport some years ago, and I found out that it was 5 years after we finished the work that the contractor got paid for the work. Now that's not ideal. It's not ideal, and it is something that each government seeks to rectify, right? And even with this new procurement legislation, there are some significant clauses in it that should close that gap. So when you continue to have conversations with your contractors and you continue to talk with them and engage them in work, what happens? Your economy keeps spinning. Your economy keeps moving. Your low-level economy, your middle and your high economy keeps moving. because the contractors keep individuals employed. And by the contractors being employed, you create that movement in the economy, in the mini mart, in the supermarket, in just entertainment. You keep that happening. And so you speak to your contractors, you keep the conversation going with your contractors. And they understand that once I continue to work in this particular space and I have a relationship with you, then I'm fine. But when you don't pay your contractors and then you blacklist, and I know the chief secretary has an issue with that line, but then you blacklist contractors or you give work to contractors that Tobagonians could do, then you're going to have a problem.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it right there, Mr. Hislop, and maybe we can get more into details about these things, and especially as these issues develop within our space.
Sure.
So thank you for being on.
It was a pleasure.
Yes, certainly. And viewers, please don't go anywhere because we'll be back right after this break with more.
We are people